So let's continue introduce our next speaker, Professor Graeme Callister. He's a senior lecturer in history and war studies, specializing in conflict, combat, and civil-military relation from the early modern period, with a particular focus on the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. He joined George St. John University in 2014, having completed his PhD at the George University with a thesis examining politics and public opinion in Western Europe at 18th and 19th century. So let's welcome Professor Graeme. Thank you so much for joining us, and the audience is all yours to begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the Peninsular War and the events that went on during this conflict. The Napoleonic Wars came to the Iberian Peninsula in 1807 when a small French army with Spanish support marched on Lisbon to punish Portugal for continuing its relations with Britain. Over the next 7 years, this conflict would spiral into a major war in its own right, seeing a French invasion of Spain, popular risings against Napoleonic control across the Iberian Peninsula, and major campaigns by Spanish, British, and Portuguese armies to chase the invaders back across the Pyrenees. Eventually, in October 1813, the Allied armies would invade France itself, playing a major role in destroying support for Napoleon's regime and helping to bring about his eventual downfall. The Napoleonic Wars were virtually a continuation of the Revolutionary Wars, and hopefully you can see the PowerPoint there with the timeline on the screen still. The Revolutionary Wars began in 1792 and ended in 1802, but after only 16 months of peace in May 1803, Britain and France found themselves once more at war, with Spain joining the war on France's side against Britain in 1804. In 1805, a joint Franco-Spanish fleet was beaten at Trafalgar, cementing Britain's dominance at sea. But from 1805 to 1807, Napoleon launched a series of campaigns that defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and conquered most of Europe from Italy to Poland. The Franco-Spanish alliance at the start of the Napoleonic Wars was not unusual. For over 2 centuries, Catholic Spain and Protestant England had been rivals and often enemies, with significant territorial disputes over the colonies and the Mediterranean. On the other hand, France had been a natural ally of Spain for much of the previous century. They'd been allied against Britain in the American War from 1778 to 1783, during the French Revolutionary Wars from 1796 to 1802, and were actually allied against Britain when the Peninsular War began, even though Napoleon did not particularly trust the Bourbon Spanish royal family. It was a different story for Portugal, though. Ever since gaining independence from Spain in the 17th century, Portugal and Spain had been rivals, meaning that Portugal found a natural ally in Britain. Despite occasional colonial and religious differences, Britain and Portugal had a close relationship by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, bolstered by major trading links. And these trading links were, ostensibly at least, the trigger cause of the Peninsular War. Having conquered Austria in 1805, Prussia in 1806, and Russia in 1807, Napoleon created a system of continental blockade against Britain, refusing permission for any British goods to land on the European continent. This basically signaled Napoleon's total control over the continent. Any gap in this blockade, however, would see it fail. When Portugal refused to be part of the continental system, offering a conduit to British trade on the continent, Napoleon dispatched an army through Spain, with his allies' permission, to threaten the Portuguese government. That was the excuse, at least. In reality, Napoleon was eager to gain control of a large Portuguese navy, which could make up for some of his losses from 1805, and to gain control of Portuguese colonies, which would harm British trade and provide money for his war effort. Even though the Portuguese regent was willing to close the ports to British shipping and even break off diplomatic relations with Britain, Napoleon ignored this and ordered his army under Junot, who you can see on the screen, to march to Lisbon. This invasion consisted of 25,000 French and Allied troops, supported by 3 columns of Spanish soldiers, numbering another 25,000 men. The expedition was led by this man, Junot, as I said, who's one of Napoleon's most trusted, if not most able, generals. It took about a month for the French army to cross Spain before moving into Portugal. Bad roads, little food, and bad November weather meant that hundreds of men and many horses were lost. The Portuguese army, nevertheless, offered no resistance, and the panicked Portuguese royal family even declared war on Britain in a desperate but futile attempt to stop the invasion. At the last minute, however, on the 29th of November, the Portuguese regent realized that he would be most likely deposed by Napoleon and accepted the offer of the British to evacuate him, the court, and the treasury to Brazil. The escape of the Portuguese royal family meant that when Junot arrived in Lisbon on the 30th of November with only 1,500 very weary soldiers, there was no resistance to his entry into the city. Over the next few days, the Spanish armies supporting Junot invaded northern and southern Portugal, occupying the Algarve in the south and Oporto in the north. At this stage, then, this looked like another enormously successful French campaign. Lisbon was occupied. The French garrison became stronger over the winter as they were reinforced, and Spanish troops who were allied to France had invaded northern Portugal and occupied part of the country. The Portuguese army, which had not opposed this, was disbanded, and although there was a little rioting amongst the Portuguese population, especially in response to the 100 million franc levy that Napoleon tried to take from them, there was no particular resistance. So it looked by the early weeks of 1808 that the Iberian Peninsula was another easy conquest for Napoleon's armies. But the story is not that simple, of course. Even as Spanish King Carlos IV and his minister Manuel Godoy agreed to support Napoleon's invasion of Portugal, Spain was in the midst of severe problems. Economically, the war against Britain had severely damaged trade. There were shortages of food and major problems with brigands, and in some areas, the demoralized local authorities simply could not control them. Probably more importantly, however, there was a growing power struggle at the heart of the Spanish government between the king and his son and heir, Fernando. Carlos and Godoy were both minor reformers, and their reforms were often seen as an attack on the nobility or the established church. In response, a group of disaffected political leaders had gathered around Ferdinand, hoping that he would be able to change his father's policies. Carlos's government was made even more unpopular because many people in court did not like the French military presence on Spanish soil. As 1808 began, some 50,000 French and Spanish reinforcements had entered Spain, and they quickly began to establish garrisons in several major Spanish cities. Godoy had hoped to drive a national revival through the French alliance, but the naval defeat at Trafalgar in 1805, and now these actions of the French army in Spain in early 1808 destroyed that hope. Although the countries were still formally allies, it was clear that Napoleon was beginning to move against Spain. But why would Napoleon attack his Spanish ally? In the first place, Napoleon was concerned that he could not trust the Spanish royal regime. When he was fighting Prussia in 1806, Napoleon had heard rumors that Spain had begun to mobilize for a land campaign, which Napoleon assumed could only be against him. He also did not like the Spanish royal family of Bourbon, which was, of course, the former ruling house of France. He had already executed a French Bourbon prince in 1805 and had overthrown the Bourbon rulers of Naples in 1806. But fundamentally, Napoleon believed that Spain was weak and inefficiently governed, and therefore was easy prey. He knew that many people and the nobility did not like their king, and he knew that the Crown Prince Ferdinand was not universally popular. Napoleon thought that this would allow him to take over without much resistance and put in place a much more efficient administration under one of his brothers, giving him both more control and a stronger ally. It would also give him control of Spain's colonies, with the lucrative silver mines of South America. Concerns about the French presence in Spain, however, combined with a severe dislike of the chief minister, essentially led to a coup in the Spanish government in the middle of March 1808. At Aranjuez, a mixture of courtiers, soldiers, and ordinary people combined to force the king to dismiss the hugely unpopular Godoy, and 2 days later forced Carlos himself to abdicate in favor of his son, who became Ferdinand VII. Yet instead of unifying Spain at this moment of crisis, this just led to recriminations between those who supported Carlos and those who supported Ferdinand. This open power struggle prevented any meaningful Spanish response to the French troops still crossing the Pyrenees, which by now totaled a huge 100,000 men under this man, Marshal Murat, Napoleon's brother-in-law. By late March of 1808, French troops were in Madrid. No war had been declared, but Napoleon clearly now had the intention of taking Spain for himself. He offered the throne to his brother Joseph, who agreed to accept, and then Napoleon invited Carlos and Ferdinand to Bayonne in southern France, where Napoleon claimed he would mediate their differences. Across Spain, the anger at the French presence was obvious. Yet without organised opposition, and with the royal government still hoping to negotiate a solution to the crisis, there was little resistance to Napoleon's forces. All of that changed on the 2nd of May 1808. Marshal Murat, commanding the French forces in Spain, gave orders that Carlos's children should be moved from Madrid to Bayonne to join their father. Fearing that their royal family was being kidnapped, a mob assembled to stop the departure. French troops opened fire, and quickly the anger of the population of Madrid spilled over into a major uprising. It was not planned or properly led, and indeed Spanish troops in barracks in the capital were ordered not to take part and to allow the French to put an end to the disorder. But it was a genuinely popular uprising against the occupying French army. Hundreds were killed in brutal street fighting before the rising was defeated the next day. National histories often point to the 2nd of May 1808 and to the brutal reprisals that followed as the start of the Spanish national uprising, where the people rose en masse to resist the French invader. Certainly by the end of May 1808, almost the whole of Spain was in upheaval. But the uprisings were not wholly the product of patriotism. With the Spanish king and his son out of the country in Bayonne, and with an apparent vacuum of power in Spain, provincial leaders, clergy, noblemen, and ordinary people took the chance to seize power in their local areas. Often these uprisings targeted French soldiers, but in other places away from the French troops, there were also deeply political undertones, as radicals, liberals, and conservatives competed to create or control local militias with the aim of taking power in their locality. Now, whatever the motivations of these provincial noblemen, clergymen, soldiers, or ordinary people, by the end of May 1808, Spain was in uproar against the French, who were now openly considered as invaders and not allies. News of this rising spread across Europe, and in Britain especially, there was excitement that this could deal a major blow to Napoleon's army. To begin with, however, Napoleon was not particularly concerned. Even more French troops were to be sent to Spain, many of them very new conscripts with very little training, and some of them from countries allied with France, but Napoleon felt that they would be enough for what he considered to be essentially a mission to pacify Spain. He did not yet seem to realize that he was involved in a major war. On the 6th of May 1808, he used threats to force Carlos and Ferdinand to abdicate the Spanish throne, placing them both under arrest in France, and announced that his brother Joseph was now the new king of Spain. However, the situation was already spiraling from Napoleon's control. Many of the leaders of the local uprisings across Spain were reluctant to submit to any central government authority, let alone Napoleon's brother as king. Moreover, the Spanish armies were now mobilizing to fight back. This included the Spanish generals occupying Portugal, who decided to march back into Spain to help the national resistance. This left large parts of Portugal ungovernable by France, and there were soon uprisings across northern Portugal to reject French rule. French armies nevertheless continued to spread across Spain, trying essentially to intimidate the Spanish into surrender. Napoleon's armies in Spain were often poor quality, but he believed that their reputation and that of their commanders would be able to make up for their weaknesses. This was a military miscalculation, and combined with a political miscalculation in underestimating the strength of Spanish hostility to being ruled by a French king, it would lead to Napoleon's armies struggling. These miscalculations came to a head in mid-July of 1808 when a French army of 20,000 men under General Dupont, which was aiming to conquer southern Spain, was surrounded by Spanish troops at Bailen and forced to surrender. Although Dupont's troops were mostly conscripts, this was the first major Napoleonic army to be captured, and it gave a huge morale boost, not just in Spain, but across Europe to the opponents of Napoleon. It also made the new Spanish King Joseph panic, and withdraw all of the French troops behind the line of the Ebro. Suddenly, from a position of power in summer 1808, the French were reduced to only a small part of central Portugal and a small strip of northern Spain. To make matters worse, the abandonment of northern Portugal left the coast wide open to support arriving from sea, which he did on the 1st of August 1808 with the arrival of Sir Arthur Wellesley's small British expeditionary force. Wellesley rapidly marched against and totally defeated Junot's now isolated French force at Vimeiro, giving British and Portuguese morale an enormous boost. Junot's French force should have been forced to capitulate like that at Bailen, but Wellesley's superiors overruled him, and in the Convention of Sintra, Junot was allowed to evacuate from Portugal with his men not being prisoners of war. Nevertheless, by the end of August 1808, the French army had been entirely removed from Portugal. Against the odds, therefore, victory seemed to be near for Portugal and Spain. In September 1808, the Spanish regional governments, or juntas, that had led the local resistance against the French agreed to form a central federal junta to run Spain in the absence of the king. But many of the men who had gained power in the early months of 1808, when the king had been arrested by Napoleon, were reluctant to give it up. So the provincial armies did not operate particularly effectively, and their response to the French withdrawal was quite slow. Nevertheless, Spanish forces moved onto the offensive, and in October, a British army under General Sir John Moore marched into Spain to support their campaign. With his initial occupying force almost entirely defeated, Napoleon realized that he could no longer leave this war in Spain to just a few second-line soldiers and second-rate generals. From September to October 1808, he therefore brought veteran troops from his armies stationed in Germany under their veteran marshals and poured them into Spain. By November, Napoleon arrived to lead them in person, and this is the biggest proof that he realized what a problem the Spanish situation had become. In only a few weeks, however, Napoleon rallied his troops and launched a huge offensive against the central Spanish armies. After victories at Espinosa and Tudela, Madrid was retaken. And the French army then marched off north, chasing off the small British force, which managed just about to escape by ship from Coruña, although the rearguard battle at that town cost Sir John Moore his life. Napoleon, believing the conquest of Spain to be almost complete, returned to Paris, leaving his marshals to finish the job of occupying the Iberian Peninsula. The early Spanish enthusiasm and the hope that they could gain a quick victory against France was crushed by this campaign of late 1808 and early 1809. Several Spanish generals did remain in the field, meaning that French control of Spain was only partial, but in early 1809, these generals did not want to risk their armies in open battle, not least because they could not replace the equipment or men that they lost. Napoleon assumed that they would therefore quickly surrender, and his brother, Joseph, could impose his regime. In February of 1809, Marshal Soult reinvaded Portugal, with another French army aiming to conquer the country for a second time. Soult's invasion of Portugal was an example of many of the problems that would damage French campaigns in Iberia over the next few years. Soult's operation was partly carried out using orders dictated by Napoleon in Paris, orders which showed no understanding of the terrain of the Iberian Peninsula and showed no understanding of Soult's army. These orders were almost entirely unrealistic. Soult's army was also not fit for the task. The soldiers were already exhausted, their clothing and shoes inadequate, and they did not have enough supplies. They did not even have enough transport for the few supplies they did have. They therefore made slow progress, taking some 5 weeks to reach Oporto. By this time, another British army had arrived in Portugal, commanded again by Sir Arthur Wellesley, the victor of Vimeiro. He marched north from Lisbon and found Soult resting at Oporto. Secretly sending several battalions across the river in some wine barges, Wellesley was able to surprise and completely overthrow Soult's army. As he had the previous year, Wellesley showed himself to be an inventive and intelligent general. Soult was forced to flee Portugal, losing 7,000 men and all of his artillery and military stores. The eviction of these French forces from Portugal gave the British government the confidence to reinforce their army and start sending significant supplies of ammunition and money to their Portuguese allies. They also sent some to Spain. It was also then possible to move the war back into Spanish territory. Almost half of Spain was now occupied by French armies, but in April 1809, help came from an unexpected direction. Without warning, Austrian armies attacked French forces in southern Germany, meaning that Napoleon had to recall tens of thousands of men to fight in the Danube Valley. The weakening of the French forces in Spain presented the opportunity for the central Spanish authorities to launch another counteroffensive against the invaders. The main effort this time would be to strike towards Madrid with the Spanish army of General de la Cuesta and the British army of General Wellesley, which it was hoped would break the main French armies in Spain. This Allied campaign, however, was not a particular success, and its failures highlight some of the key problems that would face the Allies in the coming years. Cuesta and Wellesley simply did not trust one another, and they had little respect for one another's armies. Supplies promised to Wellesley did not appear, meaning that his army was slower than it should have been, and when Cuesta tried to march on Madrid alone, he was forced to withdraw to rejoin Wellesley at Talavera. In late July, Wellesley and Cuesta won the Battle of Talavera against Marshals Jourdan and Victor, but the lack of cooperation and coordination meant that it was Wellesley's troops that bore the brunt of the battle and of the casualties. This was nevertheless another morale-boosting victory, and one for which Wellesley received the title Viscount Wellington, and this is the name by which he is more commonly known today. But the campaign ended with the British army withdrawing to Portugal and Cuesta being defeated and eventually removed from command. Many Spanish patriots used this as proof that the British army was untrustworthy and called for the liberation of Spain to be led by Spaniards. News of the defeat of Austria in July 1809 and the total failure of a British expedition against the Netherlands in the early autumn were further blows to the Allied cause. Nevertheless, the central junta of Spain decided to launch another offensive in early autumn 1809, this time using only Spanish armies, and when Wellesley, or now Wellington, was invited to take part, he declined. Two Spanish armies, therefore, mobilizing nearly 100,000 men, were supposed to converge on Madrid in a pincer movement. In the event, however, the French armies managed to isolate and heavily defeat these two Spanish forces at the battles of Ocaña in the south and Alba de Tormes in the north. The southern defeat was so bad that it opened southern Spain up to a full French invasion. Now, while the war in Central Europe had ended and Napoleon was pouring reinforcements into Spain, it did seem that things were going quite badly for the Spanish cause. But even as the regular armies of Spain suffered defeat against the invaders, popular resistance against the French continued to grow. This was the fabled guerrilla, the Little War, although much of what has been said about it has been shrouded in nationalist myth. Guerrilla fighters were not all patriots who were farmers by day and fighters at night. Many of the leaders were regular soldiers, sometimes men who had become separated from the main army but who wanted to continue to fight, and other times commanders of small units deliberately detached from the main army to harass the French. Some of the guerrillas were essentially bandits, however, robbing French supply trains because they were easy sources of plunder. Some also plundered their own people and were executed if caught by the Spanish armies. The guerrilla nonetheless played a really crucial role in the Peninsular campaigns. French armies found movements harder, and tens of thousands of soldiers were tied down in garrisons to counter irregular fighters. Guerrilla fighters harassed French convoys, messengers, and stragglers. They passed vital intelligence to Wellington and to the Spanish armies, and their presence harmed the morale of French soldiers. French operations suffered as they could not send out cavalry scouts easily, and messages between commanders had to be guarded by large bodies of soldiers. The guerrilla war is also noted for its brutality, and this too has become somewhat mythologized. At the time, many people did write about the vicious killings of civilians by French soldiers or of French soldiers by partisans, and Goya, of course, famously drew some of these paintings or pictures, but they were not published in his lifetime. But this brutality was not universal. Both sides did take prisoners, and killings were not always accompanied by torture or mutilation. This war could be brutal, but the popular violence and popular enthusiasm for the partisans should not be exaggerated. By the start of 1810, however, the initiative in the Peninsular War had definitely passed to the French. Freed from war elsewhere in Europe, Napoleon was able to send tens of thousands of reinforcements to his armies, which began a more systematic conquest of Spain. In the south, Marshal Soult advanced into Andalusia and quickly conquered most of the province, capturing Seville on the 1st of February and laying siege to Cadiz later in the month. In the east, Marshal MacDonald moved to complete the slow conquest of Catalonia. Further north, Napoleon had appointed his most experienced marshal, André Massena, to command a third invasion of Portugal. In early July, he captured the Spanish border fortress of Ciudad Rodrigo, and a month later, the Portuguese fortress of Almeida. Progress for Massena's army, however, was slow. The roads were bad, and his troops included many new conscripts, and supplies were limited. They nevertheless pushed forward against Wellington's outnumbered Anglo-Portuguese army. On the 27th of September at Busaco, Wellington's army inflicted a sharp defeat on Massena. Occupying a very steep hillside, British and Portuguese infantry were able to repulse a series of French attacks. Although the battle did nothing to change the strategic situation, its significance lies in the fact that it was the first time that the rebuilt Portuguese army had been involved in a major battlefield victory, which was very important to Portuguese morale. Wellington's army, nevertheless, was compelled to continue retreating, and Massena hoped to complete the conquest of Portugal by the winter. However, outside Lisbon, Wellington had secretly ordered the construction of some massive lines of defence, the lines of Torres Vedras. These lines were built on a series of hills that stretched from coast to coast across the peninsula on which Lisbon sat. The hills were fortified with redoubts and artillery batteries, and the land between them was flooded or heavily defended. There were 3 lines, 2 further north and 1 around Lisbon, which made it impossible for Massena's army to get near the Portuguese capital. Moreover, Wellington had ordered a scorched earth policy in areas beyond the lines, destroying houses and removing all food that would allow the French army to find shelter or supplies. This caused enormous misery for Portuguese people whose homes and farms were destroyed, but it did mean that Massena's army was forced to move north again to try to find food. Massena managed to remain in Portugal for 5 months, but his army did not have the strength to either attack the lines of Torres Vedras or to conquer the rest of the country. Now, this advance into Portugal in late 1810 was the high point of French success in the peninsula. The south of Spain was almost entirely conquered, and Cadiz was under siege. In January 1811, Soult's army took the major Spanish fortress city of Badajoz. But behind the lines of Torres Vedras, Lisbon continued to hold out, preventing the French from gaining full control of Portugal and allowing the British to continue to send men, supplies, and weapons to build up the Anglo-Portuguese army. Moreover, French operations were hampered by a lack of coordination. Marshals Massena, Soult, and MacDonald all commanded separate armies in Spain, with nobody in overall command. None of these marshals respected or listened to Joseph Bonaparte or his chief of staff, Marshal Jourdan. The marshals did not cooperate easily with one another, and they did not properly support each other in their operations. Napoleon tried to mastermind the whole campaign from Paris, but the orders he sent out showed little understanding of the true situation in Iberia and were often weeks out of date when they arrived. From 1811, therefore, the Allies were able to begin to take the initiative back. In the south of Spain, Cadiz remained under French siege, but in February 1811, a joint British and Spanish expedition landed on the coast. On the 8th of March, they defeated part of the French army at the brutal Battle of Barossa. Although they did not manage to relieve the siege of Cadiz, the defeat was damaging to the French army and showed the importance of the British and Spanish navies in allowing them to land major forces all around the coast. The main gains for the Allies, however, were in Portugal. In March 1811, Massena withdrew his army towards Spain. Wellington slowly pursued him back to the frontier and laid siege to the border fortress of Almeida, aiming to recapture it as a first step of moving back into Spain. A second Anglo-Portuguese army was dispatched under General Beresford to retake the city of Badajoz. Massena, however, regathered his forces and in early May made an attempt to relieve Almeida in the north, but he was defeated at the Battle of Fuentes de Onoro. The capture of Almeida was the end of any significant French presence in Portugal. Never again would their armies be in a position to significantly threaten or seriously threaten a conquest of Portugal. The rest of 1811, however, proved a disappointment for the Allies. Further south along the border, Beresford managed to blockade Badajoz, but was forced to lift the siege when Marshal Soult appeared with his army to relieve the city. Beresford and a Spanish force under Joaquin Blake fought and won the bloody Battle of Albuera, which allowed the siege to be re-established, but even when Wellington's army joined Beresford in late May, they were unable to capture the city. In June, the remains of Massena's army, which was now commanded by Marshal Marmont, joined that of Soult, and they marched against Wellington. Although they did not try to fight a battle, they did force Wellington to raise the siege. After this disappointment, Wellington moved his army north along the border and in September marched towards Ciudad Rodrigo. But again, the appearance of Marmont's army prevented him from laying siege to the city. The campaign of 1811 along the Spanish-Portuguese border therefore ended more or less in stalemate. Portugal was liberated from French troops, but the French were very much still in control of Spain. In the east of Spain, 1811 was even better for the French. The troops had already made some progress in pushing Spanish forces out of Catalonia. Tarragona fell in June, and French forces moved towards Valencia. In December, French Marshal Suchet managed to trap General Blake's Spanish army in the city, and in early January 1812 compelled the whole force of 20,000 men to surrender. Yet despite appearances and despite how it looks on the map, at the beginning of 1812, French armies in Iberia no longer held the upper hand. Wellington now had over 50,000 British and Portuguese soldiers available to him, and significant Spanish armies were still in the field. Moreover, with Napoleon preparing to invade Russia, many French units were withdrawn and sent to the Eastern Front. The few reinforcements that arrived were mostly poor quality conscripts. Supplies were limited, and French generals were forced to spread out their troops to try to find enough food. In January 1812, Wellington took advantage of this to march against the northern city of Ciudad Rodrigo, which he captured after a brief siege. This opened the path to invade Spain. To guard his flank, however, he also needed to capture Badajoz, which he did in April after a particularly vicious and costly assault, followed by a particularly vicious sack of the city by British troops. French marshals Marmont and Soult were unable to gather their armies in time to respond. The main thrust of the Allied effort in 1812, however, came into central Spain. Cooperation between Wellington and his Spanish allies was not perfect in this campaign, but it would become clear that they were beginning to work together much more effectively than in Wellington's last incursion into Spain in 1809. In May 1812, Wellington crossed the frontier and in June captured Salamanca, with Spanish forces playing a strong supporting role. French Marshal Marmont responded with a counterattack to try to cut Wellington's supply lines to Portugal. And after some weeks of manoeuvring, the two armies came together near Salamanca, where Wellington's Anglo-Portuguese army was able to almost entirely destroy Marmont's force. The scale of this victory has sometimes been exaggerated, especially in Britain, but it was clearly a major victory over a main French field army in western Spain. Marmont himself was badly wounded, which hampered the French response. Although the French army was able to withdraw in good order, the defeat of Marmont saw, briefly at least, French control of Spain virtually collapse. Joseph Bonaparte panicked and fled from Madrid. Fearing being cut off from France, Soult was forced to evacuate Andalusia. The siege of Cadiz was lifted for the first time in nearly 2.5 years, and Allied soldiers marched into Madrid in mid-August of 1812, over 4 years after it had first been occupied by French troops. Yet Allied success did not last. With autumn beginning, Wellington's army was halted by the fortress of Burgos, which he proved unable to capture. When Soult moved his army to threaten Wellington's supply lines, the British and Portuguese army fell back towards Portugal, abandoning all of the territory that it had gained in Spain in 1812. The French marched back into Madrid and Salamanca, but they did not have enough strength to try to reconquer the south, much less to try to reconquer Portugal. The counteroffensive from the French in autumn of 1812 looked good on the map, but it left them in a very difficult situation on the ground. Napoleon's losses in Russia meant that instead of receiving reinforcements, the French armies in Spain actually lost more men as the Emperor summoned 20,000 men to move to join him in Germany. Napoleon also refused permission for French commanders to give up any territory and consolidate their forces. To discourage other countries, especially in Germany and Eastern Europe, from turning against him, Napoleon needed to appear to be in command in Spain, so he couldn't give up any of his conquests. The result was that 200,000 French soldiers were spread out in garrisons across Spain and were able to concentrate only about a third of that number for field operations against Wellington. Wellington himself now commanded the largest single Allied army of the war, despite his previous losses. He had over 50,000 British soldiers, 30,000 Portuguese soldiers, and nearly 40,000 Spanish soldiers under his direct command. This was the first time in the Peninsular War that a foreign general had been given direct command of any Spanish troops. In early spring of 1813, Wellington advanced into Spain once more. Knowing that he had an advantage in numbers, his aim this time was to liberate Spain entirely from French control. Crossing into northern Spain, Wellington moved to outflank the main French field army, which was forced into a hasty retreat back on its supply lines. In March, Joseph Bonaparte again abandoned Madrid, and Burgos fell to the Allies without a fight. By mid-June, without even fighting a major battle, Wellington's British, Spanish, and Portuguese army had chased the French all the way back to Vitoria without a fight. Here, Joseph Bonaparte and his chief of staff, Marshal Jourdan, decided they really had to take a stand, and so on the 21st of July 1813, Wellington attacked them, and in a single day routed their army. Although the majority of his soldiers escaped, the French army was forced to abandon all of its baggage, including so much gold and art that they had plundered during their occupation of Spain, and all but one of its artillery pieces. The victory at Vitoria was massively impressive, but it was worth so much more diplomatically. By early 1813, the Russian and Prussian armies in Eastern Europe had been defeated twice by Napoleon and had agreed to a truce. Their ability to continue the war was by no means certain. The news of Vitoria came at a perfect time to persuade the wavering allies to continue the war and to persuade them that the French could be beaten. Although French control in Spain was shattered in June of 1813, it would take 4 more months of hard fighting before the French armies were pushed out of Spain. Wellington first had to take the port cities of northern Spain so that he could shorten his military supply lines, which currently stretched all the way back to Lisbon. The capture of San Sebastian took a month and ended with parts of the city burning to the ground, and for many years this was attributed to British and Portuguese troops sacking the city, although recent scholarship in Spain and Britain has cast significant doubt on this. While Wellington was besieging these northern ports, the French army made one final attempt to push the Allies back. Napoleon sent Marshal Soult back to Spain to take command of all French troops, and he immediately launched a major counterattack known as the Battle of the Pyrenees. After a week of hard and confused fighting in the mountain passes of the Pyrenees, the French army was stopped and then pushed back. After the fall of San Sebastian, a Spanish army defeated another French thrust at Saint-Martial. On the 7th of October 1813, almost exactly 6 years since the first French soldiers had crossed the Pyrenees on their way to Portugal, Wellington launched an attack on French forces holding the Bidassoa and forced a way across the river. For the first time in 20 years, an invading foreign army set foot on French territory. A month later, he beat Soult again to get his army across the Nivelle and out of the Pyrenees, breaking the back of French resistance in the south of France. It is clear at this point that Napoleon had no hope of winning the war on his southern frontier. In desperation, he even released Ferdinand from captivity, allowing him to return to Spain on the understanding that he would end the Spanish alliance with Britain and cut off their supplies. Many Spanish people rejoiced to have their king back, but almost all firmly rejected any idea that Spain should abandon its alliance with Portugal or Britain. 1814 was the first year of this war where barely a single French soldier was still in Spain. Wellington spent the early winter of 1814 pursuing Soult slowly northeast further into France. Bordeaux was captured without a fight in March. By this stage, however, the war was being won elsewhere. The great Allied victory at Leipzig in Germany in October 1813 had forced Napoleon to retreat to the French frontier. And despite a series of small victories in 1814, the far larger Allied armies steamrolled their way to Paris. The French capital eventually fell, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate unconditionally on the 6th of April 1814. But this was not quite the end of the fighting. In the south, Wellington still advanced against Soult, unaware that the war was over, and on the 10th of April he defeated Soult's army at Toulouse after a very hard and very bloody battle. 2 days later he marched into the city to find news that Napoleon had abdicated 6 days earlier. The Peninsular War then was officially over. After over 6 years, the war ended with a clear and complete Allied victory. So why is this the case? Well, the early French victories were in part due to the ineffectiveness of the Portuguese and Spanish Ancien regime governments and their armies, which virtually fell apart when they were faced with the shock of invasion. However, popular resistance and the fighting spirit of many of the Spanish armies soon showed the French that the French could be beaten. British assistance was absolutely crucial to reforming and rearming the Portuguese army and became vital to allowing the Spanish armies to remain in the field. British sea power also meant that armies in northern, southern and eastern Spain could be supplied and reinforced, which allowed them to remain active. Wellington's joint British and Portuguese army also proved vital to joint operations. Until 1811, the brunt of the fighting in Spain was borne by Spanish armies, but from 1812, Wellington's offensives, in cooperation with Spanish forces, were crucial in forcing the French back. These efforts were, of course, helped enormously by the operations of partisans and irregular fighters of the guerrilla, who provided intelligence, denied the enemy their supplies, and tied down tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. So this was a victory, but it was an Allied victory. All played their part, and none could have won it without the others. Thank you very much, and that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Professor Graeme. Thank you for your participation and giving the audience such an incredible and complete topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So during the presentation, we received some questions in the chat from the audience. They are from different countries, so we will try to answer one of them. I just like to hand over to David to get your start with some questions from the public. David, te cedo la palabra para iniciar con algunas preguntas que tiene también el público.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Sí, algunas de las que hemos recibido, la primera de ellas sería la siguiente. La Guerra de la Independencia ha sido uno de los grandes hitos de la historia española. Reúne todos los arquetipos de la imagen que se tiene del espíritu hispano: noble, caótica, popular, cruel, heroica y también pobre. La victoria de las guerrillas frente al poderoso ejército francés ha creado una aureola legendaria de aquella contienda que aún hoy pervive. La realidad fue algo muy distinta. Las guerrillas, por supuesto, jugaron un papel muy destacado, pero también fue decisiva en la participación inglesa. ¿Crees que fue gracias al ejército británico liderado por el futuro duque de Wellington quien sostuvo la guerra cuando la península estaba prácticamente sometida a Napoleón?
Okay, the first question is about the War of Independence was one of the great events in Spanish history. It embodies all the archetypes of the image we have of the Spanish spirit: noble, chaotic, popular, cruel, heroic, poor. And the victory of the guerrillas we have of the Spanish spirit. The victory of the guerrillas over the powerful French army create a legendary aura of the conflict, which still survives today. The reality was somewhat different. The guerrillas, of course, play a very prominent role, but the English participation was also decisive. Do you think it was thanks to the British Army led by the future Duke of Wellington, who supported the war when the Peninsula was practically the subjective of Napoleon?
Yes, I think Wellington's army is enormously important in keeping the war both regular and irregular. So when the Spanish people are fighting Napoleon in the irregular war, when the guerrillas are fighting, the French army is forced to leave garrisons across Spain, which means that it can't gather a main army. But that would be fine if they didn't have to fight a different force. So Wellington's army being in existence forces the French to fight with garrisons across Spain, but also with a main army, which makes it much more difficult. Wellington's army also, of course, allows weapons to go to the guerrilla fighters. They give them money, they give them weapons, they give them ammunition. So the popular uprising in Spain is helped by Wellington's army giving them supplies. So the two have to work side by side. Wellington's army would not have succeeded without the Spanish people and Portuguese people at times as well, fighting against the French. But also that popular uprising would not have succeeded without Wellington's army providing supplies and also providing a main military force to oppose the French.
Thank you very much, Professor Graeme.
Okay.
So we have other questions in the chat. David, ¿tenemos otra pregunta para realizar?
Sí, tenemos otra, Laura. Es la siguiente. Uno de los episodios menos conocidos de la Guerra Peninsular fue el reclutamiento activo de españoles en el ejército británico entre 1812 y 1813. La primera pregunta que debe hacerse es ¿qué circunstancias les llevaron a reclutar a esos regimientos? ¿Era una cuestión de números? Los británicos no tenían ningún sistema de alistamiento y confiaban en los voluntarios para completar las filas de sus regimientos.
So the second question is about one of the less known episodes of the Peninsular War was the active recruitment of Spaniards into the British Army in 1812 and 1813. The first question to us is what circumstances led to their being recruited into their regiments? It was a question of numbers, and the British had no system of enlistment and relied on volunteers to fill the ranks of their regiments. Is it now how many Spaniards pass through the English regiments?
I don't know exactly how many, but it's not a huge number. The British battalions in Spain would often recruit local men if they volunteered, but they shouldn't have done. They should really have brought all their recruits from Britain. But when they ran short on manpower, they did recruit some local Spanish men, but it's not many. Most Spanish men who fight in the Spanish army. And from 1812 and 1813, some of those Spanish forces begin to fight under British command. Wellington is given command over a Spanish army in 1813. And then in 1814, because he thinks that the Spanish government doesn't have the money to pay for supplies and to pay its army when they go into France, he actually takes that entire Spanish army and starts giving it British supplies and putting it on the British payroll. So he pays it himself rather than relying on the Spanish government. But actual Spanish men joining British battalions, there's not many. There are some, but there's not a huge number. More perhaps joined units like the King's German Legion, which was basically Hanoverian exiles who supported the British king, who fought as part of the British army. A lot more Spanish men joined that because the British army was happy to allow all foreigners to join the King's German Legion, but Spanish men joining actual British battalions, there's not many. But there were some, as you say, especially from 1812, because the British battalions just didn't have enough men. And so if someone wanted to join them, they were quite welcome to.
Thank you, Professor Graeme. Thank you for your answer. We have the final question because the time is the key. So, David, vamos a realizar una última pregunta para el ponente.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Sí, la última pregunta sería la siguiente. Los regimientos de línea británicos se designaban mediante un numeral que se añadió a partir de 1781, designaciones territoriales, como por ejemplo Oxfordshire. En el caso del 52, por ejemplo, el 52 regimiento, que se designa más o menos en el área de la cual es originaria la mayor parte de sus efectivos. A pesar de esta característica, nunca hay que olvidar que en todos ellos hay siempre una gran cantidad de naturales de Irlanda y de Escocia. La pregunta sería, ¿de dónde procedían en su mayoría los voluntarios de los regimientos ingleses que combatieron en la Guerra de España? ¿Se sabe el número de tropas británicas que comandó Wellington en la Guerra de la Península?
Okay, the last question is about British line regiments were designed by a number to which territorial designation were at from 1781, such as Oxfordshire in the case of this 52nd, which designed more or less the area from which most its troops originate. Despite this characteristic, it must never forgotten that in all of them, there is always the larger number of natives of Ireland and Scotland. Where did most of the volunteers of the English regiments that fought in the Peninsular War come from? And it is known how many British troops Wellington commanded in Spain?
So the British regiments have a number and a place, as you say, but that the place isn't actually always where the regiment recruits, because there are some areas of Britain where you get a lot more soldiers. You get more soldiers near London because it's huge, there's a lot of people, and you get more soldiers in Ireland because the Irish population is quite large and poverty often pushes people into the army. So a lot of these regiments, even if they are called Oxfordshire's, they would recruit in London, they would recruit in Ireland. So actually we end up with around a third of the British Army being Irish. And a large number of them being from the south of England, especially from around London. The Scottish regiments were almost always entirely Scottish. So the Highland regiments, the 42nd, the 79th, the 92nd, they were almost always Scottish. But if you had an English regiment, they often had a big number of Irish soldiers in them. So the recruits come from across the British Isles, really. The total numbers that Wellington commands in the Peninsula, the largest that the British Army gets to is about 60,000 men at the end of 1813. But in total, there's probably well over 100,000 British soldiers that go to Portugal or Spain at some point, because some of them go there and then are moved away. Obviously, there are casualties that need to be replaced. The army starts in 1808 at about 10,000. It's 20,000 by 1809. These are not big numbers. By 1813, there's 60,000 British troops, which is the biggest army that Britain had actually put into the onto the continent for a long time, if not ever by that stage. But of course, the British Army also had Portuguese soldiers with it, because Wellington commanded the Portuguese Army, and they made up another 30 or 40,000 soldiers for him. So the British Army, or Wellington's army, is never just a British army. It's always an allied army. The Portuguese are always there. The Spanish are there at the end. British people like to say that the Peninsular War is a British victory, but it isn't. It's an allied victory. Britain would not win this without Portuguese and Spanish forces fighting alongside them.
Thank you, Professor Callister. Thank you so much. So, excellent answer, Professor. Thank you very much for your participation in the seminar. And I would like to give the floor to David to give a brief summary of what we've seen in the presentation. David, te cedo la palabra también para hacer un breve resumen de lo que vimos en esta ponencia.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Sí, la ponencia llevada a cabo por el doctor Graeme Callister sobre Wellington y las campañas ibéricas británicas contra Napoleón entre 1808 y 1814. Recordemos que nos ha hablado sobre las principales campañas militares de Wellington en España. Ha empezado en la fecha del 27 de julio de 1809, en la que se derrotó a uno de los dos ejércitos del rey José Bonaparte, el hermano mayor de Napoleón, en la batalla de Talavera. Por ese éxito fue ascendido al estatus nobiliario con el título de vizconde de Wellington. Cuando los franceses invadieron de nuevo Portugal en 1810, los detuvo en Busaco, bloqueándoles posteriormente e impidiéndoles tomar la península de Lisboa gracias a sus magníficas construcciones de líneas terrestres de defensa en Torres Vedras, junto con la protección marítima también de la Armada Real británica con la increíble batalla de Lisboa. Las apoyadoras y hambrientas fuerzas francesas de invasión se retiraron tras 6 meses, tras lo cual Wellesley expulsó definitivamente a Francia de Portugal en 1811, luchando en las batallas de Fuentes de Oroño y la Albuera. En mayo de 1811 fue ascendido a general por sus servicios en Portugal y por su ayuda a España en la guerra contra Napoleón se le concedió el Ducado de Ciudad Rodrigo, la Cruz de la Orden Nacional de San Fernando y el Toisón de Oro. A pesar de su deslealtad cuando ordenó bombardear las manufacturas textiles en Béjar, en Salamanca, y la Real Fábrica de Porcelana del Buen Retiro de Madrid, acusando a las fuerzas napoleónicas que ya habían evacuado la ciudad. Después Wellington invadió Francia con tropas inglesas y portuguesas, aunque pues, fue derrotado, como bien sabemos, por las fuerzas francesas en Toulouse. Poco después de esta batalla, Napoleón fue desterrado a la isla de Elba en 1814. Y hasta aquí este breve resumen histórico de esta excelente intervención y ponencia del Dr. Graeme Callister. Thank you very much, Graeme, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Y we finish. We finish the presentation.